Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I've been collecting stories from the American Southwest for the better part of a decade, documenting encounters that defy easy explanation while respecting the cultural boundaries that surround them. After a recent conversation with an alumnus from a supply caravan to Black Mesa on the Navajo reservation, I learned about an incident that occurred several years ago involving one of the volunteers. Getting her contact information took some persistence. People who experience these things often prefer silence, and for good reason. When I finally reached her, let's call her Amanda for privacy, she was hesitant at first, but something about the weight of carrying this story alone seemed to convince her to share it. We met at a small diner in Flagstaff, Arizona, on a gray October afternoon in 2020. Amanda was a woman in her early 30s with prematurely gray streaks in her dark hair and eyes that seemed to dart toward every shadow. She ordered coffee but barely touched it, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped them around the warm mug. "I've never told this story in full," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not to anyone outside of those who were there. Some experiences, they change you. They make you question everything you thought you knew about the world." The diner was nearly empty, just an elderly trucker in a corner booth and a waitress who seemed more interested in her phone than our conversation. Amanda checked over her shoulder twice before continuing. "You have to understand something first," she said, leaning forward. "This happened on sacred land that holds secrets older than any of us can imagine. What I experienced there, it respected no boundaries between the seen and unseen world. And I want to make something clear from the start. I'm changing names and details out of respect for the people who helped me. Some things are meant to be spoken of carefully, if at all." She paused, taking a shaky breath before diving into the background that would make her story comprehensible. The fear in her eyes suggested that even now, years later, the memories retained their power to terrify her. Peabody coal mining had been operating in the area for decades, carving their industrial presence into a landscape that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. The company leased vast tracts of land in and around Black Mesa, creating a strange juxtaposition between ancient Navajo traditions and modern extractive industry. "The landscape out there is deceptive," Amanda explained, her fingers drumming nervously against the table. "It looks simple, rolling desert punctuated by mesas and scattered vegetation, but it's crisscrossed with dozens of arroyos, these dry creek beds that can flood without warning during the monsoon season. The topographical relief is shallow, which means when you're down in those draws you can lose your bearings completely." She described how the high desert of Arizona played tricks on perception. Distances became distorted in the clear, thin air. What looked like a short walk could stretch into miles. The sparse vegetation, mostly sagebrush, juniper, and scattered pinyon pines, provided little in the way of reliable landmarks. "I'd been on 3 previous caravans," she continued. "I thought I knew the area well enough. We were staying at a compound belonging to a local family. The patriarch, an elderly man I'll call Johnny, had allowed us to set up camp near his parents' traditional hogan. His family had been incredibly generous, sharing meals and stories with our group. The caravan was part of a humanitarian effort, bringing supplies and medical assistance to remote communities. Amanda had joined as a volunteer medic, her background as a nurse practitioner making her invaluable in areas where medical care was scarce. Johnny had a small flock of sheep and goats that his family relied on for both income and sustenance. The animals were usually well contained in a sturdy enclosure, but that particular day one of the lambs had somehow found a weak spot in the fencing. It was a valuable animal, and losing it would represent a significant financial loss for the family. She paused to sip her coffee, wincing slightly as if the memory itself left a bitter taste. I offered to help track it down. Johnny had other responsibilities that day, and I was confident in my ability to follow the animal's tracks. The lamb had headed toward one of the main arroyos that cut through the property. I figured it would be a simple matter of following the wash until I found it. Her confidence, as she would soon discover, was dangerously misplaced. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Amanda set out to track the escaped lamb. She carried a small backpack with water, her inhaler, and a radio that she assumed would keep her connected to the compound. The tracks were clear at first, small hoofprints in the sandy soil leading directly toward the main arroyo. I should have paid more attention to the radio's range, she said, shaking her head. By the time I realized I'd lost contact with Johnny and the others, I was already deep into the network of washes that sprawled across the landscape like a maze. The arroyo system was more complex than she'd anticipated. What began as a single wide wash soon branched into multiple smaller channels, each carved by decades of flash floods during the brief but intense rainy seasons. The walls rose higher around her as she followed what she hoped were the lamb's tracks, providing welcome shade but also creating a sense of increasing isolation. The tracks were becoming harder to follow, Amanda recalled. The ground was rockier, and I kept losing the trail. I'd backtrack, find what I thought were hoof prints, only to realize I'd been following the marks left by something else entirely, maybe a deer or javelina. After 2 hours of searching, she admitted to herself that she was lost. The arroyo walls were now nearly 10 feet high on either side, and when she tried to climb out for a better view, the crumbling sandstone offered little purchase. Worse, when she tried to retrace her steps, every branch in the wash looked identical. That's when I started to panic, she said, her breathing becoming slightly labored even in the telling. I've suffered from asthma since childhood, and stress is one of my worst triggers. I could feel my chest tightening, and I knew I needed to stay calm, but the isolation was overwhelming. She reached for her inhaler, taking 2 puffs of the medication, but her breathing continued to worsen. The walls of the arroyo seemed to be closing in, and the silence was so complete it felt oppressive. No birds, no insects, no wind, just the sound of her own increasingly desperate breathing echoing off the stone walls. I tried the radio again and again, but got nothing but static. I was shouting into it, probably wasting my breath, but I was desperate for any human contact. The more I couldn't breathe properly, the more panicked I became. It was a vicious cycle. Her description of the panic attack that followed was clinical in its precision, the medical training allowing her to observe her own symptoms even as she experienced them. The hyperventilation came on fast, Amanda continued, her voice taking on the detached tone of a medical professional. Classic symptoms: dizziness, tingling in my hands and feet, feeling like I couldn't get enough air despite breathing rapidly. I knew what was happening, but knowing didn't help me stop it. She had sunk down against the arroyo wall, trying to use the breathing techniques she'd learned for managing her asthma. But the panic was too strong. Her vision began to tunnel, the desert around her becoming distant and unreal. I remember thinking that this was a stupid way to die, she said with a bitter laugh. Lost in a dried-up creek bed, unable to breathe, all because I was chasing a lamb. The irony wasn't lost on me, even in my oxygen-deprived state. The last thing she remembered clearly was the feeling of the rough sandstone against her back as she slumped against the wall. The sun was still high overhead, probably around 3 in the afternoon based on the angle of the shadows. When consciousness returned, everything had changed. I came to in complete darkness, she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. For a moment, I had no idea where I was or how much time had passed. My mouth was dry as dust, and my head was pounding, but it was the silence that really disturbed me, not the normal quiet of the desert, but something deeper and more wrong. She had been unconscious for hours. The position of the moon, when she finally oriented herself enough to look up, suggested it was well past midnight. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and she was shivering in her light clothing. I tried to stand, and that's when I realized how disoriented I really was, she continued. The arroyo looked completely different in the moonlight. The familiar landmarks I thought I'd memorized were gone, or transformed into alien shapes. I honestly couldn't tell if I was in the same place where I'd collapsed, or if somehow I'd been moved. Her training kicked in as she performed a quick self-assessment. No obvious injuries, though her throat was raw and her chest still felt tight. Her backpack was still with her, the water bottle nearly empty but providing some relief for her parched throat. It was then that she heard the first sound that would haunt her dreams for years to come. A sharp crack like a dry branch breaking under pressure. The sound came from directly behind her, somewhere up on the rim of the arroyo. Amanda froze, every muscle in her body tensing as she strained to listen. The desert at night was rarely completely quiet. There should have been the rustle of small animals, the distant cry of an owl, the whisper of wind through the sage. Instead, there was only a heavy stillness that seemed to press against her eardrums. I turned around slowly, she recalled, her hands now visibly shaking as she gripped her coffee mug. In the pale moonlight, I could make out the shapes of the scattered juniper trees along the rim, and that's when I saw it, something that looked like a person crouched behind one of the larger trees. The figure was partially obscured, just a dark silhouette that seemed to be watching her, but there was something wrong with its proportions, something that made her skin crawl even as she tried to rationalize what she was seeing. "Hello?" she had called out, her voice cracking from dehydration and fear. The word echoed off the arroyo walls, seeming to linger longer than it should have. "Is someone there?" She tried to project confidence she didn't feel. "I'm with the Colorado caravan. I think I'm lost. Can you help me?" The nervous laugh that escaped her lips sounded hollow and desperate in the vast emptiness. But her medical training had taught her to remain calm in crisis situations, and she forced herself to breathe steadily as she waited for a response. After what felt like an eternity, the figure moved. It stepped out from behind the tree, and in that moment, Amanda felt a flood of relief wash over her. The shape resolved into what appeared to be a familiar form. Her friend Charlie from the caravan, someone she'd worked alongside for days. Charlie had been part of our group since the beginning, she explained to me. He was a quiet guy, really good at navigation and tracking. Seeing him there, I assumed Johnny had sent him to find me when I didn't return before dark. The figure that looked like Charlie motioned for her to follow, then began moving along the rim of the arroyo. Amanda scrambled up the crumbling wall, grateful to be out of the confining wash, and relieved to have human contact after hours of terrifying solitude. "We walked for maybe 10 minutes, she continued, her voice growing more strained. Charlie, or what I thought was Charlie, stayed about 20 feet ahead of me. He didn't respond when I called out to him, which I found odd, but I figured he was concentrating on finding the right path back to the compound. But as they walked, something began to feel fundamentally wrong. The figure's gait was strange, too fluid and silent for someone walking across rough desert terrain. And when Amanda tried to close the distance between them, the figure seemed to maintain the same spacing effortlessly, as if it were floating rather than walking. "That's when I started to feel the headache," she said, pressing her fingers against her temples. "It came on suddenly, like someone was driving an ice pick through my skull. The pain was so intense I had to stop walking entirely." When she looked up again, squinting through the agony, the landscape had changed completely. "There weren't just one of them anymore," Amanda said, her voice barely audible now. "When my vision cleared, I counted 5 figures standing in a rough semicircle in front of me, and they didn't look human anymore. The transformation was so complete and horrifying that for a moment she wondered if she was hallucinating from dehydration or suffering some kind of stroke. The figures that had appeared human from a distance now looked like large coyotes, but wrong in ways that defied description. "They were too big," she whispered. "Coyotes in that area usually weigh maybe 30 or 40 pounds. These things were the size of wolves, easily 60 or 70 pounds each. But it wasn't just their size that was wrong. It was the way they moved, the way they watched me." 10 eyes reflected the moonlight back at her, unblinking, and filled with an intelligence that seemed almost human. But it was a cold, calculating intelligence that sent primitive fear coursing through her nervous system. "I started backing away slowly," she continued. "Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I knew that running from predators was usually the wrong choice. I tried to make myself look larger, raising my arms above my head, but they just sat there watching me. The creatures made no aggressive moves as she retreated, but their stillness was somehow more terrifying than any growl or bared teeth would have been. They seemed to be studying her, evaluating her responses with the patience of experienced hunters. I backed away for maybe 50 yards before I couldn't stand it anymore," she said. "The way they were looking at me, like they were planning something. I broke and ran. Her flight through the desert was a nightmare of stumbling over hidden rocks and crashing through thorny brush. Behind her, she could hear the soft pad of feet on sand, but when she risked a glance over her shoulder, she saw nothing. I ran until my lungs were on fire," she gasped. "My asthma was acting up again, and I could feel another panic attack coming on, but the terror kept me moving. I had to stop eventually. I was hyperventilating so badly I was seeing spots." When she finally collapsed against a large boulder to catch her breath, she looked back toward the direction she'd come from. There, silhouetted against the moonlit sky on a ridgeline perhaps a quarter mile away, stood one of the creatures. And then it did something that would replay in her nightmares for years to come. It stood up, Amanda said, her voice cracking with the memory. This thing that had been on 4 legs suddenly rose up on its hind legs like a person. But the proportions were all wrong. The legs too long, the torso too narrow. It looked like someone had tried to force a coyote into human shape and failed. She paused, closing her eyes as if trying to block out the image. When she opened them again, tears had gathered at the corners. And then it screamed. Her description of the sound defied easy categorization. It began as something recognizable, a coyote's howl, but amplified and distorted beyond anything natural. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, echoing off the mesa walls and canyon surfaces, until it became a wall of noise that seemed to penetrate her bones. It was like someone had taken a coyote howl and run it through some kind of electronic distortion, she said, her hands pressed against her ears as if she could still hear it. But underneath that there was something else. Something that sounded almost like human screaming mixed in with the howl. The sound continued for nearly 30 seconds, a duration that felt like hours to Amanda's terror-stricken mind. When it finally ended, the silence that followed was so complete it felt like a physical weight. I knew I had to move, she continued. Whatever that thing was, whatever it was calling to, I couldn't just sit there waiting for it to find me. So I started running again, but more carefully this time, trying to stay quiet while still covering ground. Her escape became a desperate game of hide and seek across the broken terrain. Every shadow could conceal one of the creatures. Every sound, the rustle of wind through sage, the scurry of a small animal sent her heart racing. I kept expecting to hear that sound again, she said, or to see those eyes reflecting light somewhere behind me. But the desert had gone back to its unnatural quiet. Somehow that was almost worse than being actively pursued. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes, she saw something that made her nearly weep with relief. The headlights of a vehicle moving along what looked like a service road. I've never been so happy to see industrial infrastructure in my life, she said with a shaky laugh. It was a Peabody mine truck, probably someone doing a late-night security patrol or maintenance run. She ran toward the road, waving her arms frantically and shouting. The truck slowed, then stopped, and a middle-aged man in work coveralls rolled down his window. "You okay, miss?" he asked, clearly concerned by her disheveled appearance and obvious distress. "I'm lost," she managed to say between gasps. "I'm with the Colorado Caravan. Our leader is a man named Buck. He can explain everything if you need to check with your supervisor." The mine worker, who introduced himself only as Tom, didn't hesitate. "Hop in," he said, reaching across to open the passenger door. "I know about the caravan. We'll get you back where you belong." As Amanda climbed into the truck's cab, she felt the first real sense of safety she'd experienced since waking up in the arroyo. But as they pulled away from where she'd been standing, she made the mistake of looking in the side mirror. There, just at the edge of the headlight's reach, were multiple pairs of eyes reflecting the truck's taillights back at them. The compound was only a 15-minute drive from where Tom had found her, a fact that made Amanda realize just how far she'd actually traveled during her ordeal. As they pulled up to the familiar cluster of buildings, she could see lights still on in Johnny's parents' traditional hogan, suggesting that her absence had been discovered. "I thanked Tom profusely," she recalled. "He was clearly curious about what had happened to me, but he was professional enough not to pry. He just made sure I made it safely to the door before driving away." What happened next violated every cultural protocol Amanda had learned about interacting with traditional Navajo families, but her terror overrode all considerations of propriety. "I didn't go to the modern house where we were supposed to be staying," she said, shame creeping into her voice. "I ran straight to the hogan and pushed through the door without permission. In traditional culture, that's a serious violation, especially for a non-native woman, but I was still so scared I couldn't think straight." Inside the circular traditional dwelling, she found Johnny's parents still awake, talking quietly in Dene. When they saw her disheveled state covered in dust and desert debris, her clothes torn from crashing through brush, her face streaked with tears, their conversation stopped immediately. "I tried to explain what had happened," Amanda continued, "but I was sobbing and hyperventilating, and obviously they didn't speak much English. I kept pointing back toward the desert and trying to describe what I'd seen, but I knew how crazy it must have sounded. Johnny's father, An elderly man with deeply lined features and silver hair listened carefully to her broken explanation. As comprehension dawned on his face, Amanda watched his expression change from confusion to concern to something approaching fear. He got very quiet, she remembered. He went to the window and looked out toward the desert for a long time. Then he said something sharp to Johnny's mother in Danae, and she immediately went into action. The older woman moved with practiced efficiency to the traditional cooking area, where she collected a small metal pan filled with ash from the stove. She spread the white ash on a wooden table and began dipping bullets into it, coating each one carefully before loading them into a .357 revolver that had been stored in a wooden box. She was singing the whole time, Amanda said. It was obviously some kind of prayer or protection chant. I couldn't understand the words, but the rhythm and tone were unmistakably sacred. She kept glancing at me with this mixture of worry and something else, maybe pity. The ritual continued for nearly an hour. Johnny's mother blessed Amanda with sage smoke, pressing small bundles of sacred plants into her hands and miming for her to keep them close. The elderly woman's actions were deliberate and serious, treating Amanda's experience not as the ravings of a traumatized tourist but as a genuine spiritual emergency. They let me sleep inside that night, Amanda recalled. Johnny's father sat up with the rifle across his knees, watching the windows. I don't think he slept at all. In the morning they called for a traditional medicine man, an elderly practitioner who drove out from the main community to perform a blessing ceremony. Amanda understood little of what transpired, but the seriousness with which everyone treated her experience spoke volumes about what they believed she had encountered. Johnny arrived that morning with the rest of the caravan, she said. When his parents told him what had happened, his face went pale. He pulled me aside and said that the walkers wouldn't bother the family anymore now that we were leaving. He seemed genuinely relieved that I was unharmed. The caravan cut their trip short by 2 days, departing that afternoon rather than staying through the weekend as originally planned. As they drove away from the compound, Amanda watched the desert landscape recede through the rear window, half expecting to see familiar shapes watching from the ridgelines. I've never been back, she concluded, finishing her now cold coffee. I've done humanitarian work in other parts of the Southwest, but never again on the reservation. Some experiences change you permanently. They make you understand that the world is much larger and more mysterious than you ever imagined. She paused, looking out the diner window at the gray October sky. People ask me if I believe in the supernatural now, she said quietly. But that's the wrong question. What I experienced out there wasn't supernatural. It was part of nature, just a part that most of us are lucky enough never to encounter. The Navajo people have lived with this knowledge for generations. They have protocols and protections that go back centuries. But for someone like me, someone from outside that culture, encountering something like that without preparation or understanding, it's terrifying in ways that stay with you forever. As we left the diner and went our separate ways, I found myself scanning the shadows more carefully than usual. Some stories once heard change the way you see the world, and some experiences, even when shared secondhand, leave you understanding that the safe, rational world most of us inhabit exists alongside something far older and more dangerous than we dare to imagine. The desert keeps its secrets, but sometimes those secrets find us anyway. The summer of 2018 brought with it a decision that would haunt my family forever. After months of planning, we finally committed to a week-long retreat in the wilderness surrounding Yellowstone National Park. The rental cabin sat isolated on 40 acres of dense pine forest, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor and 5 miles from any paved road. As an 18-year-old who spent most days buried in horror novels and true crime documentaries, I welcomed the chance to disconnect from civilization and immerse myself in the kind of atmospheric solitude that fueled my imagination. Our silver SUV churned up clouds of dust as we navigated the winding dirt road that led to our temporary home. My parents, both city professionals desperate for respite from their demanding careers, chatted excitedly about hiking trails and wildlife photography opportunities. My 15-year-old sister Belle pressed her face against the rear window, watching the towering evergreens close in around us like the walls of a natural cathedral. The deeper we traveled into the forest, the more the afternoon sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy above, casting everything in a perpetual twilight that made me shiver despite the warm August air. When the cabin finally emerged from the tree line, I felt a mixture of anticipation and unease wash over me. The structure itself appeared solid enough. Rough-hewn logs weathered to a deep brown-green metal roof, wide front porch with sturdy railings. But something about its positioning troubled me. The building sat in a natural depression, surrounded on three sides by forests so thick I couldn't see more than 20 feet into the undergrowth. The fourth side opened onto a small meadow that stretched perhaps 50 yards before disappearing into more trees. It felt less like a peaceful retreat and more like being at the bottom of a well, watched by countless unseen eyes. The cabin's caretaker materialized from the shadows of the porch before we'd even finished unloading our luggage. Jeremiah Moss moved with the careful gait of a man whose joints had been worn down by decades of hard labor. His weathered face bore the deep lines and permanent squint of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors, and his pale gray eyes held a weariness that immediately put me on edge. After perfunctory introductions, he led us through the cabin's interior, pointing out the wood-burning stove, the hand-pumped well water, and the propane-powered refrigerator with the enthusiasm of a funeral director showing off caskets. The interior felt cramped despite its open floor plan. Dark wood paneling absorbed what little light filtered through the small windows, and the air carried the musty scent of old wool and something else I couldn't identify. Something organic and slightly rotten. 2 bedrooms flanked a central living area dominated by a massive stone fireplace. Belle and I would share the smaller room, while our parents took the master bedroom. Both rooms had windows facing the forest, though heavy curtains hung across each one like closed eyelids. As Jeremiah pocketed the week's rental fee, he paused at the front door and turned back to face us with an expression I couldn't quite read. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper when he spoke. "Folks, I feel obligated to mention something about this property. These woods have a way of playing tricks on the mind, especially after dark. Strange sounds carry on the wind, and shadows move in ways they shouldn't. I'm not saying you need to worry, but I strongly recommend keeping the doors locked and the curtains drawn once the sun goes down. Some things are better left unseen." My father forced a laugh that sounded too loud in the confined space. "Well, Jeremiah, we're city people, but I think we can handle a few wild animals and wind in the trees." The old man's eyes lingered on each of us in turn, his gaze settling last on Belle. "Wild animals, yes, sir. But there are other things in these woods that defy easy explanation. Things that have been here since long before any of us, and will remain long after we're gone. Just remember what I said about staying inside after sunset." With that cryptic warning hanging in the air like smoke, Jeremiah shuffled out the front door, leaving the 4 of us standing in uncomfortable silence. My mother attempted to break the tension with forced cheerfulness, suggesting we unpack and settle in before dinner, but I noticed how she kept glancing toward the windows, and how my father tested the door locks twice before joining us in arranging our belongings. The first few hours in the cabin passed peacefully enough. We distributed our clothes and personal items throughout the available space, started a fire in the stone hearth, and prepared a simple meal using the cabin's well-stocked kitchen. As afternoon melted into early evening, I claimed a corner of the living room and cracked open a paperback novel while my family played cards at the rustic dining table. The crackling fire and the gentle murmur of conversation created a false sense of security that I desperately wanted to believe in. But as the shadows outside grew longer and darker, an oppressive weight seemed to settle over the cabin. Our voices gradually became more subdued, our laughter more forced. Belle kept glancing toward the curtained windows as if expecting to see something peering back at her. My parents maintained their casual demeanor, but I caught them exchanging meaningful looks when they thought we weren't watching. Even the fire seemed to burn differently as night approached, the flames dancing in erratic patterns that cast shifting shadows across the rough-hewn walls. When full darkness finally claimed the forest, the transformation was immediate and unsettling. The ordinary sounds of the wilderness, chirping insects, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, seemed to fade into an unnatural quiet. The silence pressed against the cabin walls like a living thing, broken only by the occasional groan of settling timber and the whisper of wind through the trees. I found myself straining to hear beyond that oppressive hush, my imagination filling the void with threats that reason insisted couldn't exist. Belle was the first to crack under the mounting tension. During what should have been a light-hearted game of 20 questions, she suddenly set down her cards and announced she was going to bed. Her voice carried a tremor I'd never heard before, and her hands shook slightly as she gathered her things. I watched her retreat to our shared bedroom, noting how she kept her eyes averted from the windows as she moved through the living room. My parents followed suit shortly after, claiming exhaustion from the long drive despite the early hour. Their goodnights sounded strained, and I noticed my father checking the front door lock one final time before disappearing into their room. Within minutes, I found myself alone in the main living area, the fire reduced to glowing embers and the shadows growing deeper with each passing moment. I tried to continue reading, but the words seemed to swim on the page, my concentration shattered by a growing sense of unease. Every small sound, the settling of the roof, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant snap of a twig in the forest, sent jolts of adrenaline through my system. I told myself it was simply the adjustment to a new environment, the natural nervousness that came with being isolated in unfamiliar territory. But deep down, I knew something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The first real sign of trouble came around 10 o'clock, when a sound unlike anything I had ever heard drifted through the forest night. It started as a low moan, almost human but not quite, rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed deliberately controlled. The sound swelled and faded, like some massive creature breathing in the darkness beyond our walls. My skin erupted in goosebumps as the haunting cry echoed between the trees, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. I set my book aside and moved toward the front window, my hand reaching for the curtain before Jeremiah's warning stopped me cold. The smart thing would be to leave the fabric barrier in place, to remain hidden behind our walls of wood and glass and pretend that nothing existed beyond them. But curiosity and a perverse need to know what we were facing drove me to part the heavy material just enough to peer outside. The view revealed nothing but impenetrable darkness. The moon hung new and lightless in the sky, offering no illumination to penetrate the forest depths. Yet something in that black void seemed to pulse with malevolent awareness, as if invisible eyes were tracking my every movement from the shadows. The moaning cry rose again, closer this time, and I let the curtain fall back into place with trembling fingers. Sleep proved impossible that first night. I lay in the narrow bed, listening to Belle's steady breathing beside me, while my mind raced with increasingly dark possibilities. The strange moaning calls continued sporadically throughout the night, sometimes distant and ethereal, other times so close they seemed to emanate from just outside our bedroom window. Each new cry sent fresh waves of terror through my body, my muscles tensing as primal instincts screamed warnings about predators in the darkness. Around 2 in the morning, the temperature inside the cabin seemed to drop 20 degrees in the span of seconds. My breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and frost started forming on the inside of the windows despite the warm August night. Belle stirred restlessly beside me, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders while still remaining trapped in fitful sleep. I grabbed an extra comforter from the foot of the bed and wrapped it around my shivering form, but the cold seemed to penetrate deeper than mere fabric could reach. The moaning calls outside grew more frequent and more urgent, as if whatever made them was working itself into a frenzy. Multiple voices joined the hellish choir, creating a symphony of anguish that raised every hair on my body. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the soul-chilling sounds, but they seemed to bypass my physical senses entirely and resonate directly in my bones. That's when Belle began to change. At first, I thought she was simply having a nightmare. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, and her body twitched beneath the covers like a dreaming dog. But then she sat up abruptly, her eyes wide open and reflecting what little starlight filtered through the curtains. She stared straight ahead with an expression of absolute emptiness, as if her consciousness had fled and left only an animate shell behind. "Belle?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the continuing wails from outside. She gave no indication of hearing me. Her blank gaze remained fixed on some invisible point across the room, while her chest rose and fell in the measured rhythm of deep meditation. I called her name again, louder this time, but she might as well have been carved from stone for all the response I received. The moaning outside reached a crescendo that made the cabin walls vibrate like a tuning fork. Belle's head turned toward the curtained window with mechanical precision, her neck rotating far enough that vertebrae popped audibly in the silence. Her lips parted slightly, and for a heart-stopping moment I thought she might add her voice to the chorus of torment echoing through the forest. Instead, she rose from the bed with fluid, unnatural grace and glided toward the window. Her bare feet made no sound against the wooden floor, and her arms hung motionless at her sides like those of a marionette whose strings had been cut. I scrambled out of my own bed and followed her, terror and protective instinct warring in my chest. "Belle, stop," I hissed, grabbing her shoulder. Her skin felt like ice beneath my palm, so cold it burned my fingers on contact. She continued moving toward the window as if my touch meant nothing, as if I didn't exist. When she reached the heavy curtains, her hand rose with the same mechanical precision and grasped the fabric edge. I lunged forward and caught her wrist just as she began to pull the curtain aside. Her flesh felt corpse cold, and her pulse beat with the slow, distant rhythm of hibernation. Through the thin barrier of cloth, shadows moved against the glass, shapes that defied the laws of physics and anatomy, writhing and flowing like liquid darkness given form. "Don't look," I begged, though I wasn't sure if I was pleading with my sister or with whatever malevolent force had claimed her. "Please, Belle, don't look outside." For an eternal moment we struggled in absolute silence, her inhuman strength surprising me as she fought to expose the window. The shadows beyond the glass pressed closer, their movements becoming more agitated as if sensing their moment of triumph approaching. The moaning calls reached a fever pitch that made my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the assault ended. The cries cut off as if severed by a blade, and the oppressive cold lifted like fog before sunrise. Belle's body went limp in my arms, her normal body temperature returning in a rush that left her gasping and disoriented. She blinked rapidly, confusion replacing the vacant stare that had terrified me moments before. "What happened?" she mumbled, her voice thick with exhaustion. "Why am I standing up?" I guided her back to bed without answering, my hand still shaking from the encounter. Outside, the normal sounds of the night slowly returned. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, the distant hoot of an owl. But the memory of those shadow shapes pressed against our window lingered in my mind like a stain that no amount of rationalization could wash away. Morning brought with it a deceptive sense of normalcy that I desperately wanted to embrace. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting golden rectangles across the wooden floor and banishing the oppressive shadows that had haunted our first night. Belle woke with no memory of her midnight episode, chattering about plans for hiking and exploring the surrounding forest as if nothing had happened. My parents emerged from their bedroom looking refreshed and eager to begin their vacation activities. But I couldn't shake the memory of my sister's cold flesh and vacant stare, or the writhing shapes that had pressed themselves against our window. Over breakfast, I found myself studying Belle's face for any lingering signs of the previous night's possession, searching her eyes for traces of that terrifying emptiness. She seemed completely normal, cheerful, energetic, utterly human, yet I couldn't dispel the certainty that something fundamental had changed. My attempts to broach the subject of the previous night's events met with blank stares and nervous laughter. When I mentioned the strange calls echoing through the forest, my father suggested they'd been coyotes or wolves adapting their vocalizations to the acoustics of the valley. My mother proposed that the sudden temperature drop had been caused by a weather front moving through the area. Belle insisted she'd slept deeply and dreamlessly, with no recollection of getting up or moving around. Their rational explanations should have comforted me, but instead they heightened my sense of isolation. I was the only one who had witnessed the true horror of what transpired. The only one who understood that we were not alone in these woods. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on me like a physical burden, making it difficult to breathe and impossible to relax. After breakfast, I announced my intention to explore the surrounding area, hoping that daylight reconnaissance might reveal some rational explanation for the previous night's terror. My family decided to drive into the nearest town for supplies, leaving me alone with the vast wilderness that surrounded our temporary home. I armed myself with a hiking stick, a water bottle, and a camera, then set off into the forest with the determined stride of someone trying to convince himself he wasn't afraid. The woods in daylight proved to be an entirely different realm from the nightmare landscape of the previous evening. Shafts of golden sunlight pierced the canopy overhead, illuminating a carpet of pine needles and fallen leaves that crunched pleasantly underfoot. Birds called from hidden perches among the branches, and small creatures rustled through the undergrowth with perfectly ordinary forest sounds. The air smelled of resin and earth and growing things, a clean scent that filled my lungs and seemed to wash away some of the lingering dread. I followed what appeared to be a game trail deeper into the forest, my confidence growing with each step. Whatever had terrorized us the night before seemed to have retreated with the sunrise, leaving behind only the peaceful wilderness that my family had expected to find. Perhaps my father was right about coyotes and acoustic tricks. Perhaps my mother's weather front explanation could account for the sudden temperature change. Perhaps Belle really had been sleepwalking, and my overwrought imagination had filled in the supernatural details. But then I found the trees. 2 miles from the cabin, The forest character changed dramatically. The healthy pines and spruces gave way to a grove of damaged trees that looked as if they'd survived some sort of natural disaster. Massive gashes scarred every trunk, running from ground level to heights of 15 feet or more. The wounds appeared fresh, weeping amber sap that attracted clouds of flies and filled the air with a sickly sweet odor. I approached the nearest damaged tree with growing unease, running my fingers along the jagged edges of the wounds. The marks weren't random. They followed deliberate patterns, as if something with enormous claws had methodically shredded every surface within reach. The spacing between individual gouges suggested talons of impossible size, and the depth of the cuts indicated strength far beyond any natural predator I could imagine. Moving deeper into the damaged grove, I discovered that the destruction extended much further than I'd initially realized. Hundreds of trees bore similar wounds, creating a swath of devastation that stretched for nearly half a mile in every direction. The ground beneath my feet was littered with bark fragments and wood chips, evidence of the violent force that had created such wholesale destruction. My camera clicked steadily as I documented the scene, part of me hoping that photographic evidence might convince my family that something genuinely dangerous inhabited these woods. But with each image I captured, my sense of dread deepened. The patterns carved into the trees seemed almost ritualistic in their precision, as if the damage had been inflicted with deliberate purpose rather than random animal aggression. At the heart of the devastated grove, I discovered something that made my blood freeze in my veins. A rough circle had been cleared of undergrowth, and within that space stood a collection of structures that defied rational explanation. Tall poles fashioned from stripped branches jutted up from the earth at irregular intervals, their surfaces adorned with collections of animal bones, feathers, and strips of hide that fluttered in the breeze like macabre prayer flags. In the center of the circle sat what could only be described as an altar, a flat boulder roughly the size of a dining table, its surface stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify. Around the altar's perimeter, someone had arranged smaller stones in complex geometric patterns that hurt my eyes to look at directly. The entire scene radiated an aura of ancient malevolence that made my skin crawl and my stomach churn with nausea. I circled the clearing at a safe distance, my camera documenting everything, while my mind reeled with the implications. This wasn't the work of animals or natural forces. Someone or something had deliberately constructed this nightmare shrine in the heart of the wilderness. The thought of human beings creating such a place was disturbing enough, but the alternative explanations that crept into my mind were infinitely worse. Bones littered the ground around the altar, bleached white by weather and time. I recognized the skulls of deer and elk among the scattered remains, but other fragments belonged to animals I couldn't identify. Some appeared almost human in their configuration, though logic insisted that had to be a trick of perspective and shadow. I refused to examine them closely enough to confirm or deny my suspicions. The longer I remained in that accursed place, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The normal forest sounds that had accompanied my hike fell silent, as if even the wildlife recognized the unnatural character of the clearing. The air itself seemed to thicken, making each breath an effort and filling my lungs with the taste of copper and decay. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever evil had been nurtured in this place. But as I turned to leave, movement at the edge of my vision made me freeze. Something large and dark shifted between the trees at the clearing's perimeter, staying just out of direct sight but making its presence unmistakably known. I stood perfectly still, afraid that any movement might trigger some sort of attack, while whatever watched me from the shadows seemed to weigh its options. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the presence withdrew, leaving me alone with the twisted monuments and their grisly decorations. I backed away from the clearing with careful, measured steps, not daring to turn my back on the altar until the trees blocked it from view. Only then did I break into a run, crashing through the undergrowth with desperate urgency while branches tore at my clothes and exposed skin. I burst from the tree line and stumbled across the cabin's small meadow like a marathon runner approaching the finish line. My lungs burned with exertion, and my legs trembled from the sustained sprint through rough terrain. Behind me, the forest loomed dark and threatening despite the afternoon sunlight, its shadows seeming to reach toward me with grasping fingers that fell just short of their target. My family's SUV sat in the driveway, indicating their return from the supply run. I forced myself to walk the final 100 yards to the cabin, trying to calm my racing heart and compose my expression into something resembling normalcy. The last thing I wanted was to alarm them with wild stories about ritual sites and lurking presences, especially when I lacked any concrete evidence beyond a few photographs and my own shattered nerves. Inside, I found them unpacking groceries and discussing dinner plans with the casual ease of people who hadn't spent their morning confronting evidence of ancient evil. My mother hummed while organizing canned goods in the kitchen cabinets. My father sorted through hiking maps and trail guides with the enthusiasm of an experienced outdoorsman. Belle curled up on the living room sofa, already absorbed in one of the paperback novels she'd brought for the vacation. Their normalcy felt surreal after what I'd witnessed in the forest. I wanted to grab them all and shake them, to force them to understand that we were in terrible danger and needed to leave immediately. But looking at their relaxed faces and easy smiles, I realized how insane such a declaration would sound. They'd seen no shadow shapes at windows, witnessed no possession episodes, discovered no ritual altars decorated with bones and blood. Instead, I mumbled something about having worked up an appetite during my hike and retreated to the bathroom to clean up. In the mirror above the small sink, my reflection looked haggard and wild-eyed, with scratches across my cheek and leaves tangled in my hair. I splashed cold water on my face and tried to convince myself that fear and imagination had distorted my perceptions, that the clearing in the woods was nothing more than some eccentric artist's installation or the remnants of old hunting camps. But the photographs on my camera told a different story. As I scrolled through the images on the small LCD screen, the reality of what I discovered became undeniable. The damaged trees, the bone-decorated poles, the blood-stained altar, all of it captured in stark digital detail that left no room for rationalization or denial. Whatever inhabited these woods was real, it was malevolent, and it had been active for long enough to establish a permanent shrine in the forest's heart. The afternoon passed in a haze of forced normalcy, as I struggled to reconcile the mundane activities of vacation life with the cosmic horror lurking just beyond our walls. We played board games, prepared dinner together, and discussed plans for the following day's activities. My family attributed my subdued mood to exhaustion from the morning's hiking, accepting my explanations without question while I wrestled with increasingly urgent impulses to confess everything. As sunset approached, the familiar tension began to settle over the cabin like a suffocating blanket. Conversations became stilted and died away into uncomfortable silences. Belle kept glancing toward the windows with poorly concealed anxiety. My parents moved through their evening routines with the mechanical precision of people trying very hard to appear normal. Even they could sense that something was fundamentally wrong with this place, though they lacked the specific knowledge that made me truly terrified of what the night might bring. I helped my father secure the cabin as darkness claimed the forest outside. We checked every lock twice, tested the latches on all the windows, and drew the heavy curtains closed with particular care. He seemed grateful for my assistance, though neither of us spoke about why such precautions felt necessary. Some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge aloud, even when they pressed against our consciousness like physical weights. The second night's assault began earlier, and with greater intensity than the first. No sooner had full darkness settled over the forest than the temperature inside the cabin plummeted to levels that made our breath visible in the lamplight. Frost crept across the windows like living ice, forming patterns that resembled twisted faces and grasping hands. The electric heater my father had brought from the car labored uselessly against the supernatural cold, its heating elements glowing cherry red while producing no noticeable warmth. The moaning calls started almost immediately, but this time they were joined by other sounds that defied classification. Scratching noises echoed from the cabin's exterior walls, as if enormous claws were testing the strength of the logs that protected us. Heavy footsteps circled the building with measured persistence, pausing at each window and door to probe for weaknesses. Most terrifying of all were the voices, human-like but wrong in fundamental ways, whispering words in languages that predated civilization. Belle's transformation happened faster this time, her consciousness fleeing her body within minutes of the paranormal assault's beginning. She rose from her bed with that same mechanical grace, her face a mask of empty serenity, while her eyes reflected depths that belonged to someone or something else entirely. I was ready for her this time, positioning myself between her and the curtained window before she could reach it. "You're not taking her again," I whispered to whatever force controlled my sister's movements. Belle's head tilted at an impossible angle, her neck rotating far beyond normal human limits, while her expression remained perfectly serene. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated in my bones and made my teeth ache with sympathetic vibration. "She sees." Belle's mouth said in words that belonged to someone else. She knows. She will join the chorus when the time comes. I stepped closer, placing my hands on her ice-cold shoulders while struggling to maintain eye contact with those alien eyes. Let her go. Take me instead if you need someone, but leave my sister alone. The thing wearing Belle's face smiled with predatory satisfaction. Your devotion is noted and appreciated, but she has been chosen for specific purposes that you could never fulfill. Her mind resonates with frequencies beyond your comprehension. The scratching at the walls intensified, accompanied by impacts that shook the entire structure. Dust rained from the ceiling as something enormous struck the cabin's exterior with enough force to crack the foundation stones. The whispered voices grew louder and more insistent, chanting in rhythms that made my heart skip beats and my vision blur around the edges. Through the cacophony of supernatural assault, I heard my parents' bedroom door open. My father emerged carrying a baseball bat, his face grim with determination despite the obvious terror in his eyes. My mother followed close behind, clutching a kitchen knife that trembled in her white-knuckled grip. They took in the scene, their daughter standing vacant-eyed in my grasp while inhuman voices chanted outside our walls, with the stunned acceptance of people whose worldview had just collapsed. "Dear God," my mother whispered, her free hand rising to cover her mouth in horror. "God," the thing controlling Belle repeated with amused contempt. "Your deity holds no power in this place. These woods knew darkness before your species learned to walk upright, and they will remember that darkness long after your civilization crumbles to dust." A tremendous impact struck the front door, splintering the wooden frame and bending the heavy steel hinges. Whatever was trying to get inside possessed strength that dwarfed any natural predator, and the barrier that had protected us was beginning to fail. My father raised his bat with grim determination while my mother clutched her knife like a talisman against the approaching nightmare. The assault reached its crescendo as multiple entities threw themselves against the cabin's walls simultaneously. Windows cracked under the pressure of clawed hands that scraped against the glass with nails on chalkboard shrillness. The front door bulged inward with each impact, its frame giving way splinter by splinter while the lock mechanism groaned under impossible stress. Then, just as the barriers were about to fail completely, Belle's body convulsed in my arms. Her back arched with such violence that I heard vertebrae crack, and a scream of pure agony tore from her throat. But the voice was her own, not the alien consciousness that had been speaking through her moments before. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, and blood trickled from her nose and ears, as whatever had possessed her was forcibly expelled. The external assault ended as abruptly as it had begun. The scratching stopped, the impacts ceased, and the whispered voices faded into merciful silence. Normal forest sounds gradually returned. Crickets, owls, the rustle of wind through leaves. The supernatural cold lifted, and the frost on the windows began to melt, running down the glass like tears. Belle collapsed into my arms, her body temperature returning to normal as consciousness slowly reasserted itself. She blinked up at me with confusion and pain, her voice barely a whisper when she spoke. "Something's wrong with me," she gasped, tears streaming down her cheeks. "There's something inside my head that doesn't belong there." We didn't sleep for the remainder of that night. The four of us huddled together in the living room, every light in the cabin blazing while we waited for sunrise to release us from our vigil. Belle remained conscious but fragile, clinging to my hand while fighting against whatever foreign presence had invaded her mind. My parents sat in stunned silence, their rational worldview shattered beyond repair by what they'd witnessed. As the first pale light of dawn crept across the eastern horizon, my father began loading our belongings into the SUV with grim efficiency. None of us discussed the decision to leave. It was simply understood that we couldn't spend another night in that accursed place. My mother helped Belle pack while I gathered my own possessions, pausing only to delete the photographs from my camera. Some evidence was too dangerous to preserve. The drive away from the cabin felt like emerging from a fever dream. With each mile that passed between us and the forest, the events of the previous night seemed less real, more like the product of collective hysteria than genuine supernatural encounters. My parents began constructing rational explanations: gas leaks causing hallucinations, carbon monoxide poisoning, mass food poisoning from contaminated water. Their desperate need to return the world to logical order was almost touching in its futility. But Belle and I knew better. The presence that had invaded her mind left permanent traces. subtle alterations in her thought patterns and behavior that became more apparent in the weeks following our return home. She developed an aversion to darkness that went far beyond normal nighttime anxiety, insisting on sleeping with every light in her room burning bright. She stopped eating meat entirely, claiming that the smell reminded her of things she'd rather forget. Most troubling of all, she began speaking occasionally in the alien language we'd heard whispered outside the cabin walls. The episodes were brief and she never remembered them afterward, but I recognized the same harmonics that had resonated in my bones during her possession. Whatever had touched her mind in those woods had left part of itself behind, a seed of otherness that grew stronger with each passing day. I researched everything I could find about possession, exorcism, and spiritual cleansing, but nothing I discovered offered any hope of completely removing the foreign presence. 6 months after our return, Belle's condition began to deteriorate rapidly. The alien episodes became more frequent and lasted longer each time they occurred. During her lucid moments, she spoke of visions that leaked through from some other realm, vast cities of impossible architecture, beings of living shadow, rituals that bent reality to unthinkable purposes. She begged me to help her fight against the invasion of her mind, but I was powerless against forces that existed beyond human understanding. The end came on a winter night when Belle simply walked out of our house and disappeared into the darkness. Despite extensive searches by police and volunteers, no trace of her was ever found. But sometimes, on nights when the wind carries just the right harmonics, I hear her voice joining the chorus of whispers that echo from dark places. She's become part of whatever ancient evil inhabits those woods, her humanity subsumed into something larger and more terrible than mortal minds can comprehend. I've never spoken publicly about what really happened during our vacation, knowing that the truth would sound like the ravings of a madman, but I feel compelled to record these events, if only to warn others who might be tempted to seek solitude in those haunted woods. Some places exist outside the boundaries of our safe, rational world, and some hungers can never be satisfied by conventional prey. The entity that claimed my sister is still out there, patient and eternal, waiting for the next family seeking peace in the wilderness. It feeds on innocence and corrupts purity, turning love into a weapon against those who dare to venture into its domain. And somewhere in those dark woods, Belle's voice adds its harmony to an endless song of the damned, calling to others who might join her in that terrible choir. The cabin still stands, I'm told, offering its false promise of sanctuary to unsuspecting travelers. But those who accept its invitation will discover, as we did, that some vacations become journeys from which there is no return. The old logging road was barely visible as I hiked deeper into the forest, my boots crunching on the bed of pine needles and dead leaves. Golden shafts of late afternoon sunlight slanted down through the Douglas firs and ponderosa pines towering overhead. It was unusually quiet, with none of the typical chatter of squirrels and songbirds I was accustomed to in these woods. The old logging road was barely visible as I hiked deeper into the forest, my boots crunching on the bed of pine needles and dead leaves. Golden shafts of late afternoon sunlight slanted down through the Douglas firs and ponderosa pines towering overhead. It was unusually quiet, with none of the typical chatter of squirrels and songbirds I was accustomed to in these woods. I adjusted my pack and quickened my pace, eager to reach the backcountry campsite before dusk fell. Several campers had been reported overdue from a trip in this remote patch of national forest land. After a decade as a ranger across 5 different states, I was no stranger to the occasional lost hiker, but something felt different this time. An eerie stillness hung over the wilderness. As I approached the campsite coordinates, I froze in my tracks. The scene in the small clearing ahead made my blood run cold. 3 tents lay collapsed and torn, camping gear strewn haphazardly across the forest floor. I dropped my pack and hurried forward, surveying the carnage. Shredded sleeping bags, a smashed lantern, food scattered everywhere, like it had been ripped out of bags in a frenzy, and blood. Dark stains splattered the torn nylon of the tents. Droplets splashed across the scattered supplies. I swallowed hard, fighting down rising nausea. I'd seen my share of grisly attacks over the years, but this was something else entirely. The destruction was complete. The campsite utterly ravaged, yet no bodies, no sign at all of the 6 campers. I searched the area, looking for tracks, any clue to explain the scene or point to where the campers had gone. But there was nothing. No blood trail leading away from the site. No footprints besides my own. Even as my mind struggled to make sense of it, that uncanny silence pressed in around me, heavy and oppressive. My heart began to pound as I noticed more unnerving details. A child's stuffed teddy bear lay abandoned near one of the ruined tents, its furry body nearly torn in two, wisps of cotton-like stuffing spilling out of savage claw marks. I picked it up with a shaking hand. Unease crept up my spine. What could have done this? What creature would attack a toy with such ferocity? Questions spun in my mind as I pulled out my radio to call this in. But only static answered. I was in a dead zone, too remote for the signal to reach. I'd have to hike back out to report this. Slinging my pack back onto my shoulders, I cast one more uneasy glance around the eerie scene. Golden daylight was beginning to fade, shadows gathering between the trees. I hurried to make it out of the woods before true night fell. Just as I reached the trail, a baying howl echoed through the valley. Unlike anything I'd heard before, a primal, blood-chilling sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself it had to be a coyote or a wolf, but some ancient instinct deep in my brain screamed otherwise. I quickened my pace as true twilight fell, that unearthly howl still ringing in my ears as I plunged back into the trees. The ranger station was quiet as I arrived back late that night, the events of the day still playing over and over in my mind. I filled out an incident report and called the local authorities to organize a search and rescue operation in the morning, but I couldn't shake the sense of deep wrongness that had saturated that campsite. The feeling that I had stumbled onto something unnatural, something evil. Sleep eluded me as I tossed and turned on my cot in the ranger cabin, my mind conjuring terrible images of what could have befallen those campers. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows, I rose and brewed a pot of strong black coffee, trying to steel myself for the day ahead. I had just finished off my coffee when the station door banged open and John Tallwood stumped in. John was an elder of the local Umatilla tribe, a leathery, weather-beaten man with keen dark eyes. He often visited the station, sharing his deep knowledge of the area's history and ecology. But today, his lined face was set in an expression of grim foreboding. "Morning, John," I said in greeting. "Coffee?" "No time," he grunted, his voice rougher than usual. "I heard about the missing campers." I nodded wearily, rubbing a hand over my stubbled jaw. "I'm heading back out there now with a search team." "The scene, John. I've never seen anything like it. I don't have a clue yet what happened to those people." "You shouldn't go back out there," John said abruptly, his dark eyes intense. "There's something in those woods, something old and evil, something that shouldn't be disturbed." A chill crept up my spine at his ominous words. I'd always respected John's deep understanding of the land. He wasn't a man prone to exaggeration or delusions. If he was spooked by something out there, I knew I needed to listen. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm despite the fear prickling in my gut. "Do you know what happened to those campers?" John shook his head, looking more afraid than I'd ever seen him. He glanced out the cabin windows at the misty forest, then dropped his voice low, as if afraid something out there might hear. "There are ancient stories," he murmured, "going back many generations, of creatures that roam that valley. Not animal, not human, something in between. The old ones called them the Watchers in the woods." I frowned, trying to understand. What kind of creatures? Like Sasquatch or something? Even to my own ears it sounded ridiculous. I didn't believe in those kinds of cryptid tall tales. "Not Sasquatch," John said sharply. "These beings, the stories say they can walk like men, but they are not men. They are something other, unnatural, and they hunt." A shudder worked through me as I remembered the state of the torn-apart camp. The shredded tents, the blood, that ungodly howling rising from the trees. "There are petroglyphs in the caves in that valley," John continued. "Warnings carved by my ancestors passed down through the generations. Warnings about the Watchers and what happens to men who cross into their domain." John pulled a weathered leather-bound journal from inside his jacket and handed it to me. I cracked it open, the pages brittle beneath my fingers, filled with John's cramped handwriting. "I've recorded all the old tales here," he said gravely. "And the historical accounts. Missing trappers, slaughtered livestock, disappearances going back over a century, all centered on that valley and the surrounding hills." I scanned the yellowed pages, my skin crawling as I read account after account of strange sightings, eerie events, and people vanishing without a trace in those woods. Going back decades, even centuries, a grim history of the macabre. I looked back up at John, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. "If these stories are true," I said slowly, "then those campers, do you think—" John just looked at me, sorrow and something like pity in those dark, fathomless eyes. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I could still hear that awful howling ringing in my ears, still see the red ruin of that ravaged camp. "I have to go back," I said, my mouth dry. "I have to find out what happened to them. I can't just leave them out there." John sighed heavily, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "I know," he said, "but I'm telling you, be careful, and be ready. You're walking into something beyond the natural order, something you can't fight. The Watchers don't take kindly to trespass. You might not like what you find." With those ominous words hanging in the air, John turned and walked out, leaving me alone with just the terrible tales in that ancient journal and the knowledge that I was about to hike back into a nightmare. The morning fog hung heavy as I made my way back up the trail with the search and rescue team, the damp chill seeping into my bones. I hadn't told the others about John's dire warnings, not wanting to spook them with ghost stories before we even knew what we were dealing with. But as we trekked deeper into the thick forest, the uncanny details began to pile up. Near the trail, we found the mutilated carcasses of several deer, their bodies torn apart, entrails strewn across the bed of pine needles. It looked like a mountain lion kill, but I knew cougars rarely left that much carnage behind. They were precise killers. This bordered on sheer butchery, a frenzied kind of slaughter that set my nerves on edge. And there were other signs, more subtle, but all the more disturbing for it. Claw marks gouged into the bark of trees, too big to be from any of the usual wildlife. An eerie silence pressing in around us, even the ever-present birdsong conspicuously absent. And the shadows between the towering firs seemed to shift and seethe, even as the sun climbed higher in the sky. As we drew close to the ruined camp from the day before, I noticed something else. My compass was spinning wildly, the needle refusing to settle. I shook it, perplexed, but the anomaly persisted. Likewise, the walkie-talkie on my belt spat nothing but garbled static, even though we should have been well within range of the station by now. "What the hell is going on with the equipment?" muttered Carson, one of the other rangers, fiddling uselessly with his own malfunctioning GPS unit. I just shook my head, a cold trickle of sweat working down my back despite the chill. I was starting to wonder if there was something to those old stories after all, some kernel of truth to John's dire warnings. But it wasn't until we stepped into the clearing of the ravaged campsite that true dread settled over me like a shroud. In the stark light of day, the scene was even worse than I remembered. The churned-up dirt, the shredded tents, the dried bloodstains dark against the forest floor. "Jesus Christ," breathed Larson, another member of the team, her freckled face pale as she took in the carnage. What could have done this?" I swallowed hard past the lump in my throat. "I don't know," I admitted, "but keep your eyes peeled. Whatever it is, it might still be out there." We spread out, searching the area for any sign of the missing campers. But just like yesterday, the scene made no sense. No tracks leading away, no blood trail to suggest a wounded animal or person fleeing the destruction. It's like they had just vanished, been plucked clean out of their tents and spirited away. I was crouched down, examining the clawed-up remains of a backpack, when Larson called out from the far side of the camp. "Ranger, over here." There was a telltale tremor of fear in her voice that made me straighten up immediately, unholstering my sidearm as I jogged over to where she stood at the edge of the tray line. "What is it?" I asked sharply, my eyes darting between the trees. "Did you find something?" Larson just pointed, her hand shaking slightly. I followed the line of her finger with my gaze and felt my heart seize up painfully in my chest. There, caught on a jagged branch, was a torn piece of blood-soaked flannel. One of the campers had been wearing a shirt in that exact red and black plaid when they set out. But it was what lay beyond the scrap of fabric that made my blood run cold. The forest floor was dotted with dark, glistening splatters, stark against the brown pine needles. More blood, and this time there was a trail, leading away from the campsite and deeper into the woods, as if something had dragged a bleeding body off into the trees. My mouth went bone dry as I played my flashlight beam over the disturbing scene. I desperately wanted to believe it was just some large predator, a bear or a cougar, that had attacked the camp and carried off its prey. But I knew with a sinking feeling of dread that no animal would leave a scene like this. This was something different, something malevolent. I was about to call out to the others, to tell them we needed to pull back and regroup, when a blood-curdling scream shattered the eerie forest silence. I spun around just in time to see Larson disappearing into the trees, her scream cut off abruptly, as if a hand had clamped over her mouth. Carson took off after her, shouting her name. Larson. Larson, where are you? I plunged into the woods after them, my heart hammering behind my ribs, that terrible sense of wrongness nearly choking me. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, searching wildly for any sign of the others. But the forest had swallowed them up like quicksand. There was no sign of Larson or Carson, just the trees pressing in close and dark, and the sound of my own ragged breathing. Until another scream rang out. Carson this time. A raw, animalistic shriek of terror and pain that made every hair on my body stand on end. I crashed through the underbrush in the direction of the awful sound, praying I wouldn't be too late. But when I reached the small clearing, I stumbled to a halt, my mind reeling at the horrific sight. Carson lay crumpled against the base of a massive tree, his body bent at an unnatural angle. Dark blood painted the trunk above him in violent spatters. His head lolled at a grotesque angle, his eyes wide and staring in his too pale face, a dead face, and hunched over him, its powerful shoulders working as it cracked open his ribcage with terrible strength, was a creature that shouldn't exist, that couldn't be real. It lifted its head slowly as I stood there in shock, its muzzle dripping with black gore. Not a bear, not a cougar, but something that walked on two legs, its form hideously twisted between human and animal, some unnatural hybrid that made my mind seize with horror. Dimly I was aware of bringing my gun up, my hands moving automatically even as my paralyzed mind tried to process the nightmare-made flesh before me. The creature rose to its full height, easily 7 feet tall, its muscles rippling beneath a coat of matted dark fur. Baleful yellow eyes met mine, and its jaws peeled back in a grimacing snarl, revealing wickedly long canines. An almost human intelligence glinted in those wild eyes. This was no mere beast. This was a predator beyond my darkest imaginings. A monster. One of the Watchers. I fired without thinking, the crack of the gunshot deafening. The bullet struck the creature square in the chest. A perfect shot, but it barely flinched. Thick black blood welled up from the wound, matting the fur. It shook itself, a growl rumbling up from its barrel chest, and fixed me with a look of pure, insatiable hunger. Then it charged, moving faster than anything that size should move, bounding toward me on its powerful hind legs. I fired again, the bullet sparking off it, but it didn't slow. I turned to run, a scream building in my throat, but I only made it a few steps before an awful impact slammed into my back. Claws sank through my jacket, piercing my flesh. I crashed to the ground, the pain shocking the breath from my lungs. The creature was on me, crushing me into the dirt, its drool splattering hot on my neck. I could smell the metallic tang of blood, feel its fetid breath gusting over me as it lowered its muzzle toward my face. Blind animal panic consumed me. I groped wildly for my knife, my fingers closing around the hilt. With a hoarse cry, I twisted and slashed, the blade biting into the Watcher's shoulder. It reared back with a roar of pain and rage. In that split second I rolled, staggering to my feet and tearing off through the underbrush in a mad stumbling dash. Behind me, I could hear its furious bellows, the crashing of its bulk through the trees as it gave chase. My heart felt like it would explode, my legs pumping, thorns tearing at my skin as I plunged heedlessly through the thickets. Crashing through the woods, expecting at any moment to feel its hot breath on my back, its teeth in my flesh. But as I broke from the tree line into a wide clearing, I realized the sounds of pursuit had faded. The forest lay quiet and still around me. Too still. I stood gasping for air, my knees like jelly, my eyes darting around wildly as I gripped my knife in a shaking, bloody hand. As I staggered through the eerie stillness, the muted light filtering down through the skeletal branches overhead, I tried to get my bearings, but it was as if the attack had knocked all sense of direction from me. The trees all looked the same, the landscape strangely unfamiliar even though I knew these woods like the back of my hand. It's like the valley itself had shifted, warped into some twisted shadow of itself. My foot struck something hard and unyielding, nearly sending me sprawling. Heart pounding, I looked down, playing my flashlight beam over the object. A pile of antlers rose from the dirt, stained and cracked with age. Elk antlers by the look of them. But there were too many, a whole unnatural tangle of them, as if dozens of elk had shed their racks in the same spot season after season. No animal would do that. A soft skittering sound made me whirl, the beam of my flashlight wavering wildly. At first I saw nothing. Then my light caught a flicker of movement high up on the trunk of a massive hemlock. I traced the beam upward, my breathing shallow and fast. Claw marks. Wicked gouges in the bark, far too large to be from a bear. They stretched up and up, higher than any animal should be able to reach, as if something had scaled the sheer trunk, perching in the branches above to watch, to hunt. A sob hitched in my throat as I spun away, forcing my battered body into motion again. I had to get out of these woods, away from whatever nightmare was stalking me. But as I blundered through the brush, strange details kept capturing my horrified attention. A matted clump of fur snagged on a barberry bush, far too coarse and thick to belong to any of the usual forest denizens. The splintered remains of a deer's ribcage dangling from a branch, picked clean of all flesh, and everywhere, that same oppressive sense of being watched, stalked, hunted by something beyond all natural law. I don't know how long I stumbled through that changed and haunted landscape. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to have no meaning anymore, warped like everything else in this valley of nightmares. At some point I realized that the quality of light had changed, the forest taking on the blue shadows of oncoming dusk. My heart clenched with dread. I had to find my way out before true night fell. I couldn't survive in the dark with that thing, those things. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm me, I caught a glimpse through the trees of something that made my stomach lurch with mingled relief and trepidation. The mouth of a cave yawned in a hillside ahead, half concealed behind the hanging veil of hemlock boughs. If I could take shelter there, I might survive until morning. Might. Heart hammering behind my ribs, I broke into a limping jog, crashing through the underbrush toward that dark promise of refuge. But as I drew closer, details began to register through my terror and exhaustion, details that made my skin crawl. The ground leading to the cave mouth was beaten bare of vegetation, compacted into a hard-packed trail by the passage of many feet, many clawed, inhuman feet. And the walls of the narrow tunnel were carved with crude, disturbing petroglyphs, the kind of primal scratchings ancient humans left to mark a place of great and terrible significance. Gouged into the stone as if by vicious talons were the crude yet unmistakable figures, tall, looming shapes that walked on two legs like men, yet bore the heads of snarling beasts. The Watchers in the Wood. John Tallwood's eerie tales crashed over me, tales of unnatural creatures who had stalked this valley since time unremembered, beings who could wear the skins of men when it suited them, but whose true nature was so much older, wilder, and hungrier. Looking at those jagged pictograms, I knew with sickening certainty that those tales were no mere superstitious ghost stories. They were warnings, warnings of a horror that had endured in these hills for centuries, a horror I had now stumbled into like a fly into a spider's web. A howl split the air, far too close, the same chilling sound I had heard echoing over the ravaged campsite. Galvanized by raw terror, I darted into the cave, wedging myself into a narrow crevice in the rock wall where I could still see out through the craggy opening. The dying light painted the forest in shades of blood and shadow. That's when I saw them. Two figures moving between the trees, too tall, too fluid to be human. Even at this distance I could see the way their shoulders bunched and rippled beneath shaggy pelts, the predatory forward hunch of their spines. They paused, silhouetted against the crimson sky, and I forgot how to breathe, because in the next moment they sank to all fours and began to change, bones cracking and realigning, bodies stretching into gaunt lupine shapes that made the mind revolt. I must have made some tiny, terrified sound, even though I was trying to stay silent as the grave, because as one their heads swiveled toward me, and I had the horrifying sensation of meeting the gaze of something ancient and evil across an impossible distance. My heart seized in my chest as they swept toward me, bounding over the forest floor with terrifying speed, those loping strides devouring the distance. I scrabbled backwards deeper into the crevasse, knowing it was hopeless, that I was trapped, easy prey with nowhere to run. Then I saw them. The first unlucky campers, the ones whose remains I had been sent to find. They were there in the cave with me, their naked bodies strung up in grotesque tableaus on the rock walls, bound with crude rope woven of gut and tendon, limbs twisted at impossible angles, torsos flayed open, pale entrails spilling out in macabre garlands. Their faces were the worst, frozen in rictuses of agony and horror, eyes bulging and mouths wrenched open in silent screams. The Watchers had not just killed them, but desecrated them, played with them. Bile scorched the back of my throat, but I swallowed it down, a despairing moan trying to work its way out of me. Somehow, even in my paralyzed state, my hand had found my flashlight, and I clicked it on with trembling fingers. The quavering beam illuminated the full horror of that grisly charnel house, and immediately wished I had left myself in darkness, because daubed on the stone walls in rusty flaking brown, and the fresher crimson of newer blood, were crude drawings that told a story I could not tear my eyes from. Stick figures danced and cavorted across the rock, chasing down prey, ripping and tearing, and interspersed with the hunt were other, even more disturbing scenes, one in which dozens of smaller figures gathered around a larger one, as if in worship. Another of a human form splayed out like a perverse sacrifice, belly split wide, and there, painted over and over, was the same sigil, a triangle with a bisected circle in the center, some ancient rune denoting the Watchers' foul gods. My mind tried to make sense of it, reeling under the weight of all I had seen. These creatures, whatever they were, did not hunt like mere animals. They had human intelligence, but twisted to serve bestial cruelty. And this was their den, their larder. How long had they been bringing victims here, to this dread place? How many lives had they claimed for their dark masters? The missing hikers and campers were only the latest offerings to whatever bottomless hunger drove the Watchers. I had no more time to process the horror. No more time at all. A shadow blotted out the dying red light spilling into the cave mouth. The stink of rancid fur and blood filled my nostrils. From the corner of my eye, I saw a clawed hand grope into the crevice above my head, and I unleashed the ragged scream that had been building in my chest as I stared into the glowing eyes of my doom. In the guttering beam of my flashlight, I caught the barest glimpse of the Watcher as it loomed over me, its bulk filling the cave mouth. Matted fur, hulking shoulders, a lupine head that was paradoxically, terribly, still so human. But it was the eyes that pierced me, amber eyes that glowed with a feral, destructive intelligence that had no place in this world. A huge hand tipped with blackened claws swiped at me, and I screamed again, flinging myself sideways. The Watcher's talons scored deep furrows in the stone where my head had been a heartbeat before. I scrabbled madly over the uneven ground, trying to wedge myself deeper into the narrow crevice. The beam of my flashlight danced crazily over the cave walls, over the gruesome remains of the Watcher's former victims. Frantic, near-hysterical thoughts crashed through my terror-fogged brain. I was going to die here, in this rank den of horrors, torn to pieces and strung up like a butchered deer, my eyes pecked out by ravens. They would never even find my body. The Watchers would destroy me utterly, erase me from the world like they had so many others over the years. My blood would paint these walls, just more mute decoration for the amusement of monsters. The Watcher lunged again, its broad shoulders scraping the rock as it tried to force itself into the too narrow gap after me. I could feel its breath gusting against the back of my neck, hot and moist. Smell the carrion reek of its pelt. In a flash of panicked inspiration, I ripped my pack from my shoulders and flung it at the creature. It struck the Watcher square in the face, and it fell back with a startled grunt. In that split second of reprieve, I lunged out of the crevice, stumbling over the uneven floor toward the cave entrance in a blind, shambling run. But my flashlight beam fell across a second hulking shape filling the opening, and a shocked cry burst from my raw throat. There was no way out. They had me cornered like a rat in a trap. A heavy weight slammed into my back, crushing me to the dank cave floor in a puff of moldering leaves and animal bones. I felt a rib crack under the impact, a sear of agony. Then teeth clamped down on my shoulder, piercing my jacket, my skin sinking into my flesh. I arched my back and howled, battering uselessly at the Watcher's furred bulk with my one free arm. But it shook me like a dog with a rat, worrying me back and forth until I flopped like a rag doll, my vision sparkling with black. Its huge hands flipped me over onto my back, and its snarling muzzle filled my world, strings of drool spattering my face. I stared into those glowing eyes, saw the horrifying thread of human cruelty woven through the animal savagery. It knew what it was doing, knew it on some deep level that made the mind revolt. These were not mere unthinking predators. No, they were so much worse. I knew I was dead, knew it in my blood and bones as those terrible jaws yawned wide above my face. But as the Watcher shifted its weight, pinning me more securely beneath it, one of its knees come down hard on my flashlight at my hip. There was crack of breaking plastic and a startling stab of light as the damaged bulb flared brightly, a searing beam of illumination piercing the gloom of the cave. The Watcher flinched back with a hiss, squinting against the sudden brightness. In a flash of desperate inspiration, I snatched up the flashlight and shone it directly into the creature's eyes. It recoiled with a guttural snarl, shaking its massive head. My eyes darted wildly, searching for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. They fell on a large flat stone near my hand, and without thinking, I hefted it and brought it down with all my fading strength on the Watcher's skull. I felt bone crunch wetly under the impact. Black blood sheeted down the creature's face, matting its fur, but still it did not release me. Its lips skinned back from its teeth and it lunged for my throat, murder in its eyes. But in that instant its mate charged in with a roar, bowling the wounded Watcher off me and standing possessively over my supine body, asserting its claim to the kill. The injured Watcher struggled to its feet and squared off against its packmate, rumbling a warning deep in its throat. Even through the pain and fear, my stunned mind managed to process what I was seeing. These creatures, whatever they were bound by some twisted pack hierarchy, like wolves, yet horribly, perversely sapient. That uncannily human cognizance was there in the way they postured aggressively at each other, neither willing to cede their prize, me. It was the only chance I would get, and I seized it. In one burst of wild, adrenaline-fueled speed, I rolled to my feet and sprinted desperately for the cave mouth. The Watcher's furious howls echoed off the stone behind me. The ground shuddered under the impact of their powerful strides giving chase. Slobber-slick jaws snapped at my heels as I hurtled out into the waiting arms of the night. Somehow, my battered body carried me into the pitch dark of the forest. I crashed blindly through the underbrush, not knowing where I was going, my breath sobbing in my throat and my pulse a deafening drum in my ears. Branches slapped my face, leaving hot streaks of pain, but I felt none of it. My entire world had narrowed to the all-consuming need to escape, to survive. Behind me, I could hear the Watchers crashing through the trees, could feel the vibrations of their relentless pursuit through the soles of my feet. It was only a matter of time before they overtook me, before they dragged me down and ripped the life from my broken body. But still, I ran, unwilling to simply lie down and let death take me. Miraculously, unbelievably, I saw lights glimmering through the trees ahead, flashlight beams dancing over the knotted trunks and carpets of leaves. Heard raised voices calling out in the darkness, hollering my name. The rest of the search party, coming to look for me. "I'm here," I tried to scream, but all that came out was a strangled croak. I flung myself forward with one last burst of desperate speed, broke through the tree line onto the logging road where the other rangers were gathered, their faces pale and strained in the dancing beams of their flashlights. I collapsed into their arms, my final reserves of strength giving out at last. Gasping garbled warnings, please. They caught me as I fell, lowered me to the ground, their faces swimming above me in the wavering light. I could feel hands on me, trying to staunch the flow of blood from the deep gouges in my flesh, voices rising in consternation as they took in the extent of my injuries. But I barely registered any of it, because there, at the edge of the dark woods, I could see twin pairs of glowing amber eyes, staring, watching. The Watchers paced back and forth just beyond the reach of the light, growling their frustration. They knew they had lost their prey. This time, I faded in and out after that, as the other rangers carried me out of those cursed woods. I remember disjointed fragments, the jolt and sway of a stretcher beneath me, the wail of sirens, the sting of needles in my skin, the stark white glare of hospital lights, and the babble of doctors talking over me in low, urgent tones. But always, playing behind my eyelids in an endless loop of nightmare, the Watchers. Their dead eyes, their grasping claws, their hulking shadows falling over me. They followed me into my dreams, even drugged to the gills in my hospital bed. I would jerk awake screaming, my skin clammy with fierce sweats, expecting to see them crouched in the corner of my room, lips peeled back from razor fangs. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive, Said an animal attack of that severity should have killed me, but they didn't understand. None of them could understand the sheer mind-breaking horror of what I had witnessed. The police and rangers went back out to that damned valley to retrieve the bodies of my friends, following the rough coordinates I had gasped out between morphine drips and panic attacks. But of course they found nothing. No bodies, no den of horrors in the cave. It's like the Watchers had wiped the forest clean of any trace of their presence, like they'd never been there at all. I tried to tell people, tried to warn them about what was really out there, stalking the shadowed places, but I saw the way their faces closed off, the way they exchanged looks when they thought I couldn't see. They thought I was crazy, traumatized, just another babbling lunatic spo. I was released from the hospital after a week, my physical wounds well on their way to healing, even if my mind was still in tatters. The rangers put me on indefinite leave, promising that my job would be waiting for me when I was ready to come back. If I was ever ready to come back. But I couldn't let it go. Couldn't just languish in that purgatory of fear and doubt, going through the motions of my old life as if the horrors I had witnessed had been nothing more than a fever dream. I had to know the truth, had to understand what the Watchers were and where they had come from. I owed that much to Larson and Carson. I couldn't let their deaths be in vain. So I threw myself into research with the single-minded focus of the possessed. I scoured historical records and newspaper archives, combed through folklore collections and ancient bestiaries. Everywhere I looked, I found more stories, more accounts that matched the grim details of my own experience far too closely to be mere coincidence. A journal entry from a fur trapper in the 1820s described a nightmarish encounter with a creature that walked like a man but ran on all fours like a wolf, its eyes glinting with preternatural malevolence. A faded newspaper article from the 1950s told of a string of gruesome murders in the deep woods, victims found hanging eyeless and gutted from the trees, their screams still echoing in the night. And in crumbling tomes of myth and legend, I found whispered hints of an ancient evil that had stalked the shadowed places since the dawn of humankind. Beings that wore the skins of beasts but possessed the cruel cunning of men, neither animal nor human but some blasphemous mingling of the two. They were called by many names in many tongues: the Wargus, the Cynocephali, the Kanokaphaloi, the dog-headed men, the Watchers in the wood. The lore spoke of dark rites practiced beneath the waning moon, of blood sacrifice and depraved worship to beings from beyond the stars. It whispered of a race of shapeshifters who could walk unseen among humanity, sowing chaos and reaping terror, creatures who viewed mankind as little more than cattle to be culled. The rational part of my mind rebelled against the sheer lunatic implausibility of it all. But in my heart I knew it was true. I had seen the Watchers with my own eyes, felt the unnatural heat of their breath on my face, the cruel bite of their fangs in my flesh. They were real, and they were still out there, still hunting. Armed with this terrible knowledge, I tried one last time to warn the authorities, to make them understand the true nature of the threat that lurked in the wilderness. But I saw the way their eyes slid to the scars on my face, my neck, as I spoke, saw the pity and concern writ plain on their faces. They thought my experience had unhinged me, that I was seeing monsters where there were none. In the end, I stopped trying to convince them, let them believe what they wanted. I knew I could never rest until I had done everything in my power to end the Watchers' reign of terror. I had looked into the abyss, and it had looked back. There could be no peace for me while those soulless things still walked the earth. So I made my preparations, studied my enemy, learned their ways, and when the moon waned to a sliver in the starry sky, I ventured back into that valley of nightmares, my heart leaden in my chest but my purpose clear. I would hunt the hunters, confront the darkness on its own ground, and God's help me, I would send those bastards back to hell where they belonged, even if I had to follow them down into the abyss to do it. The night closed in around me as I hiked through the whispering trees, their leaves muttering secrets in a language only the darkness understood. An owl hooted mournfully in the distance, an omen of ill portent, but I pressed on, my senses straining, the hairs prickling on the back of my neck. I knew they were out there, watching, the Watchers. Their presence hung over the brooding forest like a shroud, the psychic stench of their malevolence thickening the air. But I forced down my fear, gripped the hilt of the silver knife at my hip tighter. I had forged it myself, etched it with runes of warding and protection gleaned from those moldering grimoires. It was the only thing I had found that might give me a fighting chance against those abominations. Time blurred. reality hazing at the edges as I stalked deeper into the Watcher's domain. The night pressed in tight and airless, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes on me, tracking me. The back of my neck crawled with the sensation of being hunted through the Ebon woods. The Watcher's woods. An unearthly howl shattered the stillness, rising to a chilling crescendo. And another. And another. Hunting cries. The eager voices of the pack scenting prey. My blood turned to ice in my veins. They had found me. I broke into a run, crashing mindlessly through the tangled undergrowth as the keep of the hunt rose behind me. Closer, closer. The guttural baying dopplering through the trees shot through with a hellish sapient glee. They were toying with me, savoring my terror as they closed in for the kill. I burst into a clearing and whirled to face my pursuers, my knife flashing sickly in the moonlight. The Watchers prowled out of the tree line, amber eyes aglow, lips peeled back from glistening fangs. Gods, there were so many of them. A dozen at least, maybe more, their furred, hulking bodies bristling as they paced back and forth, hemming me in, cutting off my escape. One of them stepped forward, looming tall on its hind legs. Its eyes glittered with a predatory, alien intelligence as it surveyed me, and I knew with sick certainty that it was the Alpha, the pack leader. It must have outweighed me 3 times over, its sinewy bulk rippling beneath its matted pelt. I saw the ropes of drool dangling from its lolling tongue, the wicked curve of its claws. It was death incarnate. My breath sawed in my lungs as I raised the silver blade in a pitiful last show of defiance. At the sight of the moon-washed metal, the Watchers stirred and growled, betraying a sliver of what might have been uncertainty. I seized on that flicker of hesitation and charged with a wordless cry. The Alpha met me head-on, a tidal wave of fur and fang and fury. We crashed together and went tumbling to the loamy earth, kicking and clawing. I felt the slash of talons across my ribs, the crunch of bone, agony blazed through my body. But still I fought, slashing at my foe with the silver knife, opening great gouts of blackish blood. The Watcher howled, more enraged than hurt, and redoubled its assault. But I lost myself in the red haze of battle, hacking and slashing as the two of us rolled back and forth in a morass of gore. I knew I couldn't last long. Already my strength was failing, my vision sparking out at the edges, but by God I would make the beast pay for every drop of my blood in kind. I didn't see the blow that finally felled me, only felt the crack of my skull hitting stone, the world smearing sideways into darkness. In a blink, the Watcher was on me, pinning me to the ground, its foul breath gusting over my face. I lay there dazed and broken, tasting blood in my mouth, as the creature raised one great taloned hand for the killing stroke. The end had come. But as I stared my death in its pitiless, glowing eyes, I felt a curious sense of peace settle over me. I had fought the good fight, done what I could to rid the world of this evil, even if it had proven too great for me in the end. There was an honor in that, a victory of spirit, if not of flesh. I bared my teeth up at my destroyer in one last defiant snarl, daring it to finish me and be damned. But the blow never fell. The Watcher paused, its head tilting to one side as it studied my ruined face. Its nostrils flared, scenting the air, and its eyes narrowed as if in recognition. A shiver worked through its huge body, its muscles clenching and rolling beneath its skin. And then, to my slack-jawed disbelief, it backed off me, drew away, melting back into the shadows of the trees, the rest of the pack following suit with whines of confusion. Within moments they had vanished into the gloom as if they had never been, leaving me lying there in the blood-spattered dirt, my mind reeling. I struggled to sit up, gasping at the flash of pain in my savaged side. I couldn't understand it. The Watcher had had me dead to rights. I had seen my own death reflecting back at me from behind its eyes. So why had it spared me? It wasn't until later, after I had dragged myself out of those woods and back to some semblance of civilization, that the pieces fell into place. When I stared into the mirror, taking stock of my battered body, and noticed the change that had come over me. My eyes, dear God, my eyes. They glowed a familiar baleful amber in the shadows. The same febrile, primal hue I knew all too well from my nightmares. I remembered then, with dawning horror, the bite I had taken during my first hellish encounter with the Watchers, recalled the burn of infection that had seared through my blood in the days following. The strange, unsettling changes that had crept over my mind and flesh. The way my senses had grown sharper, my wounds knitting with preternatural speed. The way I had felt less and less human by the day. The knowledge crashed over me then, buckling my knees with its awful weight. The Watchers, the bite, it hadn't just scarred me, it had contaminated me, polluted me with its same unclean essence, corrupted me on a genetic level, warping me into something that was no longer wholly human. I was infected, becoming. And the Watchers had sensed that, out there in the woods, sensed the change taking hold, smelled their own foul blood in my veins. That's why the Alpha had stayed its claws at the very last, why it had let me live. Because I belonged to them now, to the pack. The room spun around me, the walls pressing in like a tomb. I sank to the cold tile floor, a howl of despair building in my throat, bleak and ravaged. It burst out of me in a raw, animalistic cry, reverberating off the bathroom acoustics. But there, threaded through that wordless anguish, was a keening note of terrible hunger, of bloodlust. I heard it, recognized it for what it was, and laughed. A jagged, fractured sound, sharp enough to cut. Because what else could I do, in the face of such a cruel cosmic joke, such a twisted irony? I had set out to destroy the monsters, only to become one myself. In the mirror, a pair of feral amber eyes stared back at me, dancing with mad mirth. The eyes of the beast, the eyes of a watcher. I fled into the wilderness after that, driven by my despair and the horrible clawing need, gnawing at my insides. Embraced the monstrosity growing in my flesh, succumbing to the curse twisting me into something less than human. Out there, far from civilization, I could give in to the change without fear of harming anyone else, could sate the hunger, the bloodlust, stalking the lonely places like the beast I had become. But even then, in the depths of my damnation, some stubborn sliver of my humanity held on, refused to let me surrender completely to the animal urges subsuming my mind. Somehow, I clung to some ragged sense of purpose, warped though it was. I would use this affliction, this unholy power to continue the fight against the Watchers, to prey upon the predators, hunting the creatures that had destroyed my life and the lives of so many others. For years, I waged my solitary, twilight war in the shadows beneath the trees, became a monster to fight monsters. At times, I nearly lost myself to the seductive call of the kill, the dark glory of the hunt. But always, I pulled back from that precipice at the last instant, remembering the man I had once been. Until the night I found the campers, a pair of young hikers, their tent shredded, their fire scattered. They cringed from me when I approached, stinking of terror, seeing only a blood-drenched beast looming out of the darkness. I knew that fear, knew it all too well, but I had no time to gentle them, to explain what I was, and why I was there, because I smelled them on the wind. The Watchers. My nostrils flared, my sharpened senses unraveling the spoor of musk and old blood. Those soulless fiends had marked these kids for death, just like all the other victims whose dismembered remains I had stumbled across over the years, remains I had grimly burned, denying the Watchers their tainted sacrament. But tonight would be different. Tonight I was here, and God's help me, I wouldn't let these two suffer the same fate as those other poor bastards. The pack was bigger this time, nearly 24 strong, their eyes glinting with malicious cunning in the moonlight. They must have caught my scent, because they didn't attack straight away like I'd seen them do before. Instead, they fanned out, trying to encircle us, cut off every avenue of escape. Saliva flooded my mouth, my pulse pounding in my temples as I scented their rank musk. My curse curdled in my veins, responding to the presence of the beasts that had infected me. I could feel the change trying to take hold, the beast struggling to break free, but I pushed it down, clamping my jaws shut on a howl. Drew upon every shred of discipline and self-control I had left, the lessons hard-earned over the years of living with this marrow-deep corruption. I wouldn't surrender to it. Not now. Not yet. The campers huddled behind me, shaking like the last leaves of autumn. I could smell the acrid reek of their urine, their mortal fear. They thought I was one of the things hunting them, some strange alpha competing for the privilege of the kill. If they only knew the truth. "Stay behind me," I snarled, my voice guttural and thick around my swollen tongue. "And when you see an opening, run like hell and don't look back." I didn't wait for a response. With a howl of challenge, I hurtled across the glade toward the watchers. The pack leader rose up to meet me, a rippling mass of fur and sinew. We crashed together, fang to fang, an explosion of animal fury. The world narrowed down to the snap of teeth and the slick rend of flesh. We rolled across the broken earth in a snarling, slavering tangle, gouged and clawed, each of us fighting for dominance. I felt my ribs crack, hot blood slicking my muzzle, dug my claws into the watcher's throat, seeking the pulsing jugular, tore at it, savaging, worrying, until the creature spasmed and bucked beneath me. But even as I crouched over my slain foe, my sides heaving, I knew it wasn't over. The rest of the pack was still out there, circling, waiting for their opening. I saw their shadows flit through the trees, heard the harsh rasp of their breathing. I risked a glance behind me and glimpsed the campers' pale, staring faces through the underbrush. They hadn't fled, the fools, just crouched there in the scrub, paralyzed with terror, half out of their minds with the horrors they had seen. A fresh surge of desperation shot through me. They were dead if they stayed here. Dead or worse. I had to make them understand. I opened my mouth to snarl another command, to shock them into action, but my voice caught in my throat, my tongue cleaving to the roof of my mouth, because in that split second, in the clarity of the kill, I felt the shackles of the beast slip my mind completely for the first time in years, felt the last mist of the curse lift from my brain like a veil. God help me, I was human again, or as close as I was likely ever going to get, with the blood of monsters humming through my veins. But with that humanity came memory, came the crushing weight of guilt and grief for all that I had done, all that I had become, for the man that I had been, now lost forever to the teeth of this unholy. The knowledge crashed over me like a wave, threatening to sweep me under. But I couldn't afford to drown in it, not now, not with innocent lives hanging in the balance. I shook my head savagely, wrestling my mind back from the precipice. Later, there would be time enough later to reckon with my sins, assuming I survived this night. Drawing upon the last raw dregs of my strength, I heaved myself to my feet, stepped forward to place my body between the watchers and their prey, the campers I had saved, the ones I had bled to protect. "Go," I growled, low and deadly. "Get out of here, while you still can." I heard them scramble to their feet behind me, the crackling of brush and dead leaves. The watchers heard it too, their ears swiveled forward, their eyes flashing with renewed bloodlust. A low, eager whine mounted from a dozen straining throats. I bared my teeth in a feral grin.
"Come on then, you bastards," I hissed. "Come finish what you started all those years ago. I'm right here."
With a chorus of howls, the pack surged forward as one ravening mass. I leapt to meet them, my knife flashing in one hand, my claws extended on the other. We crashed together in a maelstrom of torn flesh and spraying blood, a whirlwind of destruction. I lost myself in the red haze of battle, hacking and slashing, all semblance of control or finesse vanishing beneath the tide of my rage. I don't know how long we fought. Time lost all meaning, narrowing down to the brutal, eternal present. The burn of fang and claw, the hot, coppery reek of blood in my nostrils, the percussive slam of my heart in my chest. I killed and killed again, the beast within me rising up to glory in the slaughter. But there were too many, my injuries too grave. I felt my strength flagging, my body failing. A taloned hand caught me across the face, laying my cheek open to the bone. Another drove into my gut like a spear, lifting me off my feet. I crashed to the ground in a broken heap, the breath driven from my lungs in an explosive gasp. Through the descending veil of darkness, I saw the watchers crowd around my fallen form, felt their rank breath gusting over my skin as they closed in for the kill. I tried to rise, to lift my knife for one last strike, but my limbs were leaden, my blood-slick fingers clumsy and weak. So this was how it ended. After everything I had endured, every horror I had faced, this was to be my fate, torn to pieces by the monsters that had made me one of their own. There was a bitter irony to that, a grim poetry that even my hazed mind could appreciate. I closed my eyes, waiting for the killing blow, surrendering myself at last to the inevitable. But it never came. Instead, I heard a sharp crack, then another, heard the watchers howl, a sound of surprise and pain rather than triumph. My eyes flew open again, straining to make sense of what was happening. The campers. They hadn't fled after all. Instead, they stood at the edge of the clearing, pale and determined, clutching thick branches they must have torn from the trees. Even as I watched, the girl swung her makeshift club in a whistling arc, catching the nearest watcher across the snout with a sickening crunch. The creature reeled back, yelping, dark blood matting its muzzle. The boy followed up with a strike of his own, smashing his branch into another watcher's ribs with all his strength. I heard bone crack, saw the beast stagger sideways with a grunt. The pack milled in confusion, caught off guard by this unexpected resistance. They'd had no challengers save me for so long, grown complacent in their superiority. They didn't know how to respond to prey that fought back. The campers pressed their advantage, wading into the fray with wordless cries of desperate courage, their clubs rising and falling. The watchers fell back before that onslaught, suddenly unsure. I saw fear kindling in their eyes for the first time, smelled it souring their musk. With a titanic effort, I dragged myself back to my feet, locked my hand around the hilt of my fallen knife, swaying but upright. The camper's bravery had bought me a precious handful of seconds, had shaken the watchers' confidence, thrown them into disarray. I wouldn't let that sacrifice be in vain. Roaring my defiance, I hurled myself back into the fight, drove my blade into the alpha's throat even as it turned to snap at me, my momentum carrying us both to the ground. We thrashed and rolled, a snarling tangle of fur and blood-slick limbs. The alpha's claws raked my shoulders, my sides. Its teeth struggled to find my face, my throat. But I was past pain, past fear, past everything but the need to end this once and for all. With a bellow of effort, I rammed my knife up under the alpha's chin, punching through the roof of its mouth and into its brain. I felt the crunch of bone, the hot gush of blood and cerebral fluid over my fist. The creature convulsed wildly, its eyes bulging, then went slack in my grip. I wrenched my blade free and rolled to my feet, breathing hard. The rest of the watchers were in full retreat now, fleeing back into the trees. I saw a handful of still forms crumpled on the ground, felled by the campers' flailing clubs. We had hurt them, badly, driven them off. For now. But even in defeat, I saw the malevolence in their eyes as they slipped into the shadows. The promise of retribution. They would be back, and in greater numbers. This wasn't over. It would never be over. The girl and boy stumbled to my side, their young faces drawn and bruised in the thin moonlight trickling through the trees. I saw their eyes widen as they took in the ruin of my body, the blood-drenched tatters of my clothes, the extent of my wounds. But there was no fear in their expressions now, no revulsion, only a grim sort of understanding. "Mister?" the boy asked, his voice thin and thready with exhaustion. Are you okay?" Something inside me cracked at the question, a dam bursting. Because no, I wasn't okay. I would never be okay again. These kids had seen me for what I was, at my lowest and most base. They knew the truth of the monster inside me, the monster I had become. But they had fought for me anyway, stood with me against the dark, even at the risk of their own lives. There was a fierce, defiant purity in that, an affirmation of something I had thought long lost, my humanity. In that moment, I felt the beast inside me retreat, slinking back into the shadows of my psyche. It would be back. It would always be back, hungering for blood and savagery, but it didn't control me. Not anymore. Not unless I let it. I had a choice. Maybe I always had. I met the boy's eyes, and then the girl's, saw my own weary, battered face reflected back at me. "I will be," I rasped. "Thanks to you." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't redemption. Those would be a long time coming if they ever did at all. But it was a start. A first step back toward the light, out of the abyss of wrath and teeth and blood I had drowned in for so long. "Come on," I said, sheathing my knife. "Let's get you two out of here. It isn't safe." We turned our backs on the carnage, on the ravaged clearing, limped off through the trees towards the distant lights of civilization, towards a world that could never understand the horror we had faced, the nightmares we would carry with us for the rest of our lives. But that was all right. We had each other now, this strange little band of survivors. We were alive against all odds, against the Watcher's feral malice. We would bear witness to the truth of what stalked these woods, even if no one else believed. And maybe, just maybe, we would find a way to fight it, to push back the darkness one brutal inch at a time. It was a war we might never win, but by God, we would never stop trying. My name is Richard Lewis, and I am 65 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me in September of 2010, but the memory of it is as fresh as if it were yesterday. I've been a park ranger in Yellowstone National Park for 15 years now, married with 2 kids, a dog, the whole suburban bliss situation tucked into a corner of this wild place. You'd think I got used to it, to the scale of the wilderness and the secrets it holds. But the truth is, you never quite do. That particular day started like most others. I woke up at dawn, kissed my wife Sarah goodbye, and headed out for my routine patrols through my assigned section of the park. The air was crisp with the first hints of autumn, and the early morning mist was just starting to lift from the valleys. My job was to check for illegal campers, make sure those trail permits were in order, and generally keep an eye on things. Yellowstone's a tourist magnet, but we try to keep things as controlled as possible. I was nearing one of the more remote offshoots of the Pelican Valley when I spotted it. A carcass, a good few hundred feet off the trail, half obscured by bushes. From the size, I guessed it was an elk. I frowned in annoyance, thinking of the paperwork if it turned out to be a poaching case. With a sigh, I radioed in my location and made my way towards it. Wolves were a possibility too, of course. It'd be good to know which for the sake of the visitors. But as I got closer, I saw the first sign that something was very, very wrong. There was no blood around the carcass. Not a drop. I stopped in my tracks, a chill creeping up my spine. I'm no greenhorn. I've seen my share of predator kills, and this made no sense. The closer I got, the worse it became. The elk's bones were picked absolutely clean. No trace of meat, nor any sign of gnawing. It looked surgical somehow. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. And then I caught a whiff of the rotten stench clinging to the remains. I gagged, my stomach churning. It wasn't the natural decay of carrion. It had a sickening sweetness to it, mixed with something metallic. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. I turned to go when something massive exploded from the bushes behind me. I staggered from the impact, barely managing to avoid its lunge. I whipped around, my gun already in my hand, to see the thing. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered before. It stood on 2 legs, easily twice my height, its body lean and muscled in a way that was wrong. Skin stretched tight over bulging sinew, a sickly gray color. The head, disproportionately small atop its broad shoulders, had a skull-like appearance, and jaws that dripped with drool. Its eyes were milky white, no pupils, just empty orbs that seemed to stare right through me. Panic shot through me, hot and blinding. I fired off a shot, more out of instinct than anything else. The creature flinched back, making a hissing sound that made my teeth rattle. The second shot went wild, and then I was running like my life depended on it, because it did. I heard it pounding after me, the trees whipping by in a blur. At one point, its claws tore through my jacket, leaving burning gashes on my back. I stumbled, and the world tilted crazily, but I managed to keep myself upright. I finally burst through the tree line and onto the trail. A family out on a hike watched open-mouthed as I sprinted by, the creature hot on my heels. I screamed at them to run. They reacted a moment too late. The dad tried to put himself between his family and the thing, but it swiped him aside with ridiculous ease. His body crashed into a tree. I heard his wife scream. I kept running. Shots cracked behind me. The creature roared and abruptly changed course. I looked back just in time to see it lunge for one of the park cops, the ones frantically responding to my Mayday call. They barely had time to register what was happening before the creature was on them, and then it was a maelstrom of blood and screams and gunfire. I ran until my lungs threatened to burst. I ran until the sounds of carnage behind me faded, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Eventually, I found a fallen log, half hidden by ferns, and crouched there, gasping for breath. The trembling wouldn't stop. For a long time, all I could do was try not to throw up and wait for rescue. I don't remember much of the next few hours. There was a helicopter, a field medic, and a whole lot of confused questions. I was in shock. The thing I saw, it shouldn't have been possible. Nobody believed my description, of course. Predator attack, they kept saying. Maybe even a rogue grizzly. The incident made national news. 4 dead, a horrifying creature sighted by a hysterical ranger. In the end, it was dismissed as post-traumatic hallucinations. I was forced to undergo psych evaluations, put on temporary leave. all the while having nightmares about those empty eyes and razor-sharp claws. My family bore the brunt of it. The whispers when we went to the supermarket, the flinches whenever my kids made too much noise. My wife Sarah stood by me, fierce as a mama bear protecting her cubs, but I could see the stress in her eyes, the strain on our marriage. One night I woke up screaming, my heart pounding a frantic tattoo against my ribs. Sarah was by my side in an instant, soothing words spilling from her mouth even as she switched on the bedside lamp. And in the soft light I noticed it. A thin, glistening trail of mucus on the pillow, and a strange, acrid smell clinging to my skin. I spent the rest of that night in the shower scrubbing myself raw, trying to wash away the feeling of wrongness. In the morning, pretending to be fine, pretending not to notice Sarah's worried glances, I dug through my gear, found my old hunting rifle, the one Grandpa taught me to shoot with back when I was just a kid. It felt heavy in my trembling hands. No way I was letting it come for my family too. My resignation letter was the most difficult thing I ever wrote. Sarah didn't try to stop me, just held me tight and whispered, "Be careful." Then with a last kiss for her and the kids, I got in my truck and drove back to Yellowstone. I found my way to that clearing near Pelican Valley, the place where it all began. The stench nearly made me lose my breakfast all over again. I steeled myself. The rifle held steady, and followed the putrid trail deeper into the woods. For a long time it was like chasing shadows, half-heard noises, glimpses of mottled gray disappearing behind the trees. Then I found another carcass, this one a deer, picked clean the same way as the elk. My rage exploded, grief fueling its fire. They should have believed me. They should have done something. I pushed forward, my movements growing less measured. The forest seemed to watch with an ancient sort of malice. The air charged with a crackling intensity that set my teeth on edge. I had no doubt I was the one being hunted now. And then, there it was. Lounging in a clearing, the light filtering through the leaves casting strange patterns on its grotesque hide. The rage bubbled over. The thing lifted its skull-like head, its nostrils quivering. Before it could react, I aimed and fired. The roar of the rifle echoed, followed by a shriek of pain. The creature staggered, blood spraying the grass. It looked at me, those horrible eyes wide. Surprise flickered across them, maybe even fear. For a moment, the impossible dared to feel possible, and then it charged. My second shot missed. My third lodged itself in its shoulder, slowing it just enough. I flung the rifle away and sprinted back towards the trees, the creature's enraged bellows filling the air behind me. I scrambled up a gnarled old tree. I was high enough to see over the undergrowth when the creature finally came crashing into the clearing. It circled the base of the trunk, frustrated growls rumbling from its depths. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would burst from my chest. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, me perched precariously in a tree, the monster below, neither of us willing to give an inch. As the light began to fade, the creature turned its empty eyes up towards me, and I felt the first trickle of despair. It wasn't going to leave. I was going to die up here, alone and forgotten. But then a glimmer of movement in the distance caught my eye. A pack of wolves, at least 6 strong, slinking silently through the underbrush. They zeroed in on the creature. Something ancient flared in its expression then, a primal understanding passing between them. It turned, and with a last look in my direction, loped off into the gathering darkness. The wolves watched it go, and then without a backward glance, disappeared back into the twilight. I didn't move for a long time, every muscle screaming in protest. Finally, with shaking legs, I climbed down. My journey back to my truck was a blur. Every rustle of leaves had me flinching, my hands slick with cold sweat. When I finally got home, Sarah just held me. No questions, just understanding, and the scent of her familiar perfume washing over me. The nightmares lessened after that, fading into a dull, constant dread that was almost manageable. The resignation and relief warred within me. Park rangers are called to protect, but on some days that means protecting the public from monsters that aren't supposed to exist. And sometimes it means protecting the monsters from us. I never went back to my section of the park. Something safer, something that didn't leave me haunted by empty white eyes and the sweet metallic stench of death. Not many can understand the aftermath. My scars run deep, seen clearly only by my wife and those who share a bond forged in the heart of Yellowstone's secrets. They say time heals all wounds. They're wrong. Some wounds mark you for life. Reminders that the world is wilder and far more terrible than we dare imagine. As I sit here years later, I can't help but wonder, is it still out there, that unnatural predator? And if it is, who will be the next to stumble upon its hunting grounds? All I know is that the wilderness holds secrets, and some of them have teeth.